right, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Emily Cantrell and I'm the director at World Trade Center Seattle. A little bit about us, we are one of more than 300 World Trade Centers all around the globe. We're owned by the Port of Seattle and we're operated by Columbia Hospitality, which is a Seattle-based hospitality company. We are a member-based organization and we're going on 22 years of bringing leaders together. And normally we do that with both social and educational programs. We're sticking with our mission of bringing leaders together through virtual programs. And we're doing that with our Navigating Business in Times of Crisis series. And this is a 3-part series. We're in phase 1 right now, which is adapting to what COVID-19 has done to our world. The next phase will be recovering, and then the third and final phase will be looking ahead. So for those of you who are members of World Trade Center Seattle and have been to our events, you know that typically our events are on the smaller scale, and we normally don't allow video in for our educational programs, but we've tossed that out the window as we are now actually recording this series for anyone who could not make it. So this will be uploaded to our new YouTube channel later on today. And another beauty of virtual programming is the ability to attract attendees and speakers from all around the world. And that has never been more true than today, as we have speakers from New York, Australia, and Germany. So welcome, everyone. First up, we have Florian Endter and Anthony Giordano and Paul Somers. All three of them met during their IE Brown Executive MBA program, which is a blended MBA program between IE Business School in Madrid and Brown University in Rhode Island. As part of their key research project, the three spent months researching virtual work, and their paper was published in MISQE. That is a highly regarded journal in management information systems. No small feat, so congratulations to you. Paul currently works at Australia Council for the Arts, where the creative sector has been amongst the most innovative in terms of virtual work and virtual performances. Florian currently engages virtually with the whole team at INMAC. That's the platform of professional OTC energy trading for Europe. He successfully transferred a legal department of a Fortune 500 corporation from one location to another while working remotely. That sounds like it would be difficult to do, even in person. And Anthony is currently managing the Our Bus marketing team across India, New York, and multiple US locations. During the pandemic, Our Bus actually increased its communication with customers. And previously, Anthony had his own marketing practice with clients in 5 continents at the same time. So welcome to you once again. Let's get started. And let's start this off with a little fun question. Anthony, let's start with you. What is your most awkward remote working moment? And then we'll move on to Paul and Florian.
Sounds good. And thanks, Emily, and welcome everybody. Glad to be here as part of this webinar and living out our research in person. So hopefully we'll be able to shed a few interesting pieces of information for everybody today. I definitely went full on into remote working, and actually part of the IE Brown program for a quarter of it I spent remotely traveling around Asia. So my remote working story comes from Bali when I landed in the airport just before midnight, had to get on a call with my team, had the taxi driver take me to a small bodega, pick up a SIM card, get it in my phone. He started driving. It was a few-hour trip. Got on the phone, realized about a half hour away from what I thought was the destination that he did not have the same impression of where we were going. So he actually just decided to stop the car in a parking lot while I was on the phone with everybody and scream and yell that if we didn't give him more money, he was going to leave our stuff on the side of the road at 2 in the morning. So I had to very calmly excuse myself from the phone call and sort out the situation, agree to a little more money to take us to our hotel. And luckily it all worked out well, and the team was great and understanding. And we're concerned about what was going on, but definitely understanding the situation, was able to navigate through that and get back on the phone with them when I got to the hotel.
Nice. Communication is key, especially in foreign countries.
Sure.
Paul, your most awkward remote working moment?
Yeah, mine I guess was a little bit mixed of a in-person and remote experience as well, where we had an event in Sydney for around about 50 people when I was working at Google. And we were trying to bring on some thought leaders in a very similar way to this, where we had some people who were due to dial in from Dublin and also then from China. And it took us around about 15 minutes to actually organize the technical setup for that, despite the fact that we had technical assistance available to us at the organization and so on. And you know, it's really, really bad in general when it takes a little bit of time to respond to the technical issues that you do have. But when you are then doing it in front of 50 people, it makes it infinitely more challenging and more awkward. Suffice to say, the manager didn't stay for a huge amount longer at the company, which was very unfortunate. But certainly just one of those classic moments where the tech can easily fail at any moment, and it's something that I wouldn't wish upon anyone.
Hopefully everything goes smoothly for the next hour here. Florian, how about you?
Well, thanks for inviting all of us, and yeah, warm welcome to everyone now who has joined. My most awkward moment, I had a little bit time to reflect, as Paul and Anthony were first, was actually just a couple of weeks ago when we had a chat with the customer, and they were sharing the screen, and like into the discussion, she switched to her WhatsApp group and started typing while everyone was looking at her screen because she didn't switch it off again, which is something where you see, like, even if the IT side works, it can be still a tricky path to pursue.
Good reminders all around. All right, thank you for sharing that. And just so everyone knows, we'll spend the next maybe 25, 30 minutes going over this presentation, and then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So to start us off, Paul, can you give us a little background on your paper?
Yeah, sure. I won't go into a huge amount of detail on our paper in terms of, you know, there is a huge backstory behind it, but we really wanted to bring things forward to the world that we're currently living in, which is obviously COVID related. So when we wrote our paper, which was actually a couple of years ago now, there's actually no way in the world that we could have foreseen, you know, an event which would have brought on this distributed work revolution in the way that COVID certainly has. And so really some part of how we were thinking about this to you know, really get us into the topic was, you know, it's just, we should first and foremost mention that the cost of this COVID scenario that we're in is so substantial. And, you know, we really pay our respects first and foremost to the folks who have been impacted at a health type level and a medical level, because really, you know, the fact that we're here, we're able to connect in this way, that we have jobs, we can put food on the table and so on, is something that isn't afforded to many other folks out there. So with the paper that we did do, there are a couple of things that we saw and that we were really, you know, eager to explore. And so, for example, when we were discussing topics that we wanted to look at, we had, as Anthony mentioned, Anthony was traveling around Southeast Asia, having a wonderful time, whilst Florian and myself were, you know, in our more stable locations. And so we just in some ways thought at a very personal level in terms of this potential topic that it was one that we were very interested in. We all loved the idea of potentially working remotely, and that was something that really attracted us to the topic. On the other hand, we were attracted at some level to this idea of virtual work in the context of thinking about huge projects that get done in a very, very short amount of time with experts coming in from around the world. And one of the early examples that we were really attracted to was Hollywood, you know, where we think about Hollywood as creating these blockbuster films. We think about a huge number of people working on the production of that. And you're really flying people in from all around the world at a very, very concentrated moment in time to actually create something that's really, really important. And given that Hollywood is such a huge success, and given that I don't think for many organizations it's much of an extension to think about their work in a similar way, in that it is a big project. You do have a lot of different people out there coming together at a certain point in time and really bringing different skill sets and levels of expertise. So on one hand, we were very individually attracted to the topic. On the other, we saw that there were a lot of really interesting and huge projects that do get undertaken very, very successfully without everyone being in the same office per se. So that was really the catalyst for us then spending a huge amount of time on that topic. So there's, I guess, three things that we were eager to briefly touch upon today, I guess, in the broader context then of COVID in light of virtual work. So the first for our participants is to say, we're 100% sure that there are a number of things that you've done in the last couple of months, which are fantastic and exactly what we would consider best in class or good practice or whatever the case might be. And we just wanted to give you folks some assurance that you're not doing something unique, you're not doing something that's not a really positive thing, that you should actually pat yourself on the back in some ways, and that I'm sure you've done many of the steps that we advocated in our broader model. The second thing though is, and maybe this is slightly more provocative, is that we really wanted to challenge your thinking about the whole world of virtual work. We spoke to some experts across the globe on this topic, and we just didn't really know how much detail, how much thought, how much consideration was put to successful organizations who really do the virtual work experience really, really well, not just from an organizational perspective, but just as much from the individual perspective of the person actually working from home and doing that work for the organization. And then the final thing we wanted to briefly touch on was, we are operating on a continuum in the sense of, virtual work existed 30 years ago in the academic literature. Where we are today, virtual work couldn't be more real in terms of the fact that most of us are actually operating in that environment. But certainly there will be a future to virtual work as well. And within that future, that's something that we'd encourage everyone to think about perhaps on this conversation is, COVID is COVID and everyone's working around that in their own way, in their own capacity virtually. But there may well be a time in the future where virtual work is really useful to you. It's really important to you, your teams, your organization, and so on. And so with that being said, we really just wanted to have those three items here today that we can walk you through in some detail to give you not just maybe the COVID perspective on virtual work, which is obviously mission critical for where we are today, but just to note that we are on a much broader continuum, and the paper that we looked at very much covered that broader system and that broader range of time, as opposed to just this very, very isolated moment and unique moment in time that we currently find ourselves. So I'll pass over to Florian to talk us through perhaps some of them, the biggest misperceptions that we saw in engaging with a number of thought leaders around the world from these respective organizations.
Yeah, so thanks, Paul. Let us begin our journey. Let's start with you, sitting where you are today, like having recently experienced what it's like to work in a virtual environment. It may have been your first time, it may have been your last time, or somehow in between, somewhere in between. We are sure it has been a unique experience for every one of you, and it's probably not exactly what you have expected beforehand. And that's exactly where we found out in talking to some of the leaders that we have a perception of what remote work is and where the strengths and the weaknesses are. And some things we just didn't expect, and we would like to share that with you. And maybe just boiling down to the 5 leading misperceptions that we found out. The first one, and I just name them in turn, and then we go into deeper levels. The first one is speed of execution. So there's a perception that remote workers will be unable to perform at the same speed as in-office employees. The second one is about output maximization. So most people think that there's less output in an remote work setting than in an in-office setting. Also, team communication, there's lower frequency and less quality. As a fourth point, we discovered that performance management is said that management needs to closely examine what remote workers do in order to keep abreast. And finally, cost cutting. That company will reduce costs quite a bit if they go at least partially remote. Now going in turn back to the first one, speed of execution. What we saw was the reality is that speed is often quicker than in office. As the employee, if the optimal work environment is established, doesn't spend too much time on meetings. The meetings themselves are much better prepared, and it's more up to the remote worker to organize themselves in a way that's really meaningful, as opposed to being in an in-office setting where you are a little bit more forced to the people around you, how to adapt while you work in the morning or in the evening, things like that. You can more easily do when you are in a remote setting. Second misperception was about output maximization. So what we found out that there's often more output in an in-office, in a remote work setting than in an in-office setting. And why is that? One of the things that really struck us was saying, well, remote employees, they actually can't hide in being busy and attending multiple meetings. So what you can do in the office, just go for one meeting after the other, and everyone thinks you're super busy but not productive. It changes completely if you work from a remote setting. And it's very basic, because in a remote setting, your output is simply what you deliver. So there's a tendency, and you might have experienced that in the last couple of weeks as well, that people go beyond what they would have done in the office because they want to finish up something, they stay late, they are more responsive to some extent. So output maximization was actually, and I could see that myself the last weeks, was actually something that we really discovered it's better in this setting. Team communication, it depends. We found out that the best in class have equal or even more effective communication. That's because they set up purposeful communication and be very inclusive of all employees. So like everyone's looking at their favorite channels, but you have to be mindful of, okay, some messages you convey better in a short video sequence. Some you put on Slack. That's one of the favorite tools, at least in the organization that I was working at. And some are put into emails or on a personal one-to-one communication. So if you have all these different tools available and you make a deliberate choice of the tools you actually use, then team communication really gets much better and actually fits the purpose you are using it for. Performance management was the fourth misperception. And it's actually not that tricky to see what a remote employee is doing, because you see the output, you see what actually has happened during the day. So if you check in the morning and check in the evening, you pretty much know what they have done during the day. They can't just hide by saying, well, I was busy doing X, Y, Z. You say, okay, show me what you have done, because it's all there. And so the monitoring itself isn't really complicated, because everything is clearly visible. If you make it visible in terms of, okay, let's walk me through what you've done during the day. The fun is about cost cutting. There is in reality really a lot of extra cost for IT that you have to set up if you have a completely or partially remote work setting. And we found out that actually equals the savings from reduced office space. Yes, you save on costs for having office space and desks and chairs and everything in these regards, but you really have to make sure that the whole backbone of your company, which is the IT, is really top notch, and you can't have a server on site, for example, that all the employees can tap into. So one thing that's maybe as a wrap up in this one, just a food for thought is, I mean, cost cutting, people think that if someone works remotely, they are cheaper, but that's actually not the case. Going virtual doesn't mean that you reduce the salary. The people actually will get the same, but they will have well, they will not come to the office, because in the end, if remote work is interchangeable, they can go to anyone else in the industry. So if you don't pay them on the same level, they're not going to come to you, but to your competitors. Maybe I'll leave it here and pass it over, and we can discuss questions around that later on. That would be like the myths that we found out and that we want to clear out of the way before we focus on remote work in this case.
Thank you so much, Florian. So you talked about the companies that have achieved, they prove that these myths are not true. So Paul, can you walk us through some of the organizations that have found success? What are they doing to actually achieve those outcomes?
Yeah, what we realized is that there was at some level just a huge amount of consideration by a couple of leading companies in particular, Buffer, Trello, Google, and various other folks who we spoke to. And it wasn't that they achieved the outcomes that Florian mentioned just by fluke or just by hoping for the best in sending their employees to a virtual environment. They really had deeply considered all of these three aspects of both mental readiness, technical readiness, and what we referred to as relationship readiness before actually sending out their teams and folks to the virtual environment. So what a lot of organizations do is they think simply that the only difference between in-office and a virtual employee is really just that physical location. But if you think about that at a much deeper level, you appreciate that there are actually just so many different dimensions to engaging and obtaining output from an employee that you wouldn't necessarily consider if you considered it exactly the same way as you did as the person who is only 10 meters down the hall from you in the office. And so what we looked at were these issues or opportunities for organizations to really consider in order to really maximize performance in that environment. Now, the challenge with COVID is basically no one's being given the time to almost even consider these things. So it's like, for example, if you were running out of a house that was burning and then someone said to you, how was my running form as I was running out of the house? You kind of go, look, just the fact that you got out of the fire is a good thing. Maybe you weren't breathing properly or you didn't have the best posture or something. They're kind of almost irrelevant to you just getting out and doing what you need to do. So, we looked at environments that were much more stable, I guess, than the COVID one that we are in. And I just wanted to give you some brief comments around these issues of the organizations and the way they thought and considered it. So when we're talking about mental readiness, what you're really talking about is, most of the way that work and life is defined, it almost is that there's a tension. So if I think about terms even like work life versus home life, or if I think about things like work versus play, or I think about work-life balance, they're always referring to this tension between those two things. And what you're doing in working in a virtual environment is that you're basically just packing potentially all of that together in terms of an environment. We all probably sit, 3 meters behind us to watch DVDs from our virtual office environment. We engage in great dinners and catch-ups with friends and so on. All of that is around you in terms of the environment that you're in, and actually being able to balance that and actually understand, well, what are the limits and how do I give myself the headspace to actually focus just on work? Or how do I give myself the headspace to just focus on family commitments or whatever the case might be? Really delineating that and understanding that and creating a cadence around that is really, really important. The second piece is the technical setup. And maybe for a lot of people joining on this call, it's not such a big thing, but I was just thinking about an example where I might say to Florian, like, Florian, can you email me the PDF version of the watermarked document of the latest version in Word? Can we then send that to a board alias, which has now got one new member on it that has instructions not only of the board papers, but then also of how to download the Microsoft Teams app, which is across iOS, Android, web browser, and so on. And can you just make sure all of that then gets uploaded to Google Drive so that everyone can view it, but not these two people? And I'm just using that as an example to say, you know, we might be comfortable and familiar talking with that type of language, but for many people, that will be a language that is completely unknown to them. And that there might be a number of newer tools that are introduced in the virtual environment. There might be a lot of people who might have only really been used to actually that physical interaction in terms of getting a lot of their work done or obtaining knowledge from certain people. And so just by way of moving to this virtual environment, you really just don't have that opportunity to necessarily engage in that way. And, you know, also thinking that there are probably a lot of things that we're very, very comfortable and familiar with given our working life, but then also then thinking about that maybe younger group of folks even who are probably talking more on like a TikTok or a Vine type of basis, or many other platforms or ways to communicate that we might not be so familiar with. So really trying to be as democratic as possible and very clear with the tools that are being used and so on isn't a trivial undertaking. And the better companies that we saw really considered that at a great level. Then in terms of relationships, you know, one way to think about that is I had a director when I worked at Google who used to say that teams that eat together stay together. And what he meant by that was really there is a lot of opportunity of what I'll refer to as the glue of a team, which is around eating together. It might be having coffees together. You know, it might just be enjoying a beer after a week at work or whatever the case might be. You know, the relationships are formed on that basis, and you really get to know people at a very, very different level by virtue of that physical experience that you do have together. And, you know, it would seem and maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable to maybe share lunch on a virtual type call with someone for many different reasons. So what these better organizations do is actually think about ways to almost replicate that type of interaction, but to have that in a much more physical, in a much more virtual environment. So, yeah, I'll leave it maybe with Anthony to talk through some of those aspects in a little bit more detail. But, you know, really it's rethinking the way that relationships can happen in that virtual environment, given the constraints that we do have, but also recognizing that at some level we all need that glue as humans to stick together and stay together through difficult or easy times.
There have been a lot of virtual happy hours I'm sure we've all been a part of. So anything to try and keep the team together. Thank you, Paul. And so, yeah, Anthony, can you tell us more about the model that you put together to help these companies be successful with the transition?
Yeah, definitely. And well, of course, the first biggest change, we had a 3-stage model. And just to give you an idea of the mindset we were in a few years ago, it was preparation, implementation, and virtualization. Right. And now we're pretty much all in the stage of virtualization. So we've taken that COVID rocket ship instead of taking the stairs here from this image, and, you know, we've sort of all immersed in it. But now is, you know, a good time to sort of take a step back and hopefully leverage some of the things that we uncovered with really speaking to those, you know, to the best organizations about how they manage their virtual employees. So how we developed this was the 3 different issues: mental, technical, and relationship readiness that we uncovered. What actions did these companies actually take to go about preparing their employees? So we had 12 steps overall within these 3 stages, and we look at it now, and 5 of them have sort of been condensed and disappeared, right? And some of these were things like hiring the right type of people. And very interestingly, Companies who are leaders in remote work are actually talking about the type of people who they hire. And one thing is that they expect their employees who are working remotely to have multiple interests outside of work. They're really looking for well-rounded people that can take advantage of this remote setting and then be able to produce the output that's needed, interact with the company, and then also have these side interests that maybe then also help them to produce better solutions for the company. But this type of multi-interest person was something that was really important in hiring. So obviously that's not something that's going to be really effective right now in the COVID situation. Also integrating mixed virtual and in-office teams. Well, we're all virtual now, so can't really do that. And then scheduling face-to-face meetings. So this is definitely something that you want to do with your team, which is now virtual after we're able to do that. But it's not something that is going to be done in the current environment. And we had this linear approach sort of happening over time, but now we're in a single stage. So what takeaways do we have from this 3-stage model to really go all into one stage? You'll see very small text on the left, which is the actual model, which you can definitely find online, and it was in a link in the description. But I'll go through 7 of the main takeaways that we had from there that are definitely still very relevant in the current environment and never more relevant, really. In the area of mental readiness. So first is a term virtual intelligence training. So, and Paul and Florian were kind of alluding to this, but how do you communicate and how do you really delimit work from non-work? I live in a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, in New York, and there's the bedroom and the main living space, which is an open area that I'm in right now, and then the bathroom, and that's it, right? So at what point do I sort of take my laptop away from the dining room table, and then that becomes dinner time and less email, work, and marketing time, right? And that's something that the companies that are really successfully having remote workforces are thinking through some of those things. And Trello, for instance, they mandate that every person who's going to work from home has to have a room with a door that isn't your bedroom. So if you have that, great, you can work from home. If you don't, then you have to get a co-working space, and then they'll fund the monthly payments for that co-working space. So, as opposed to other companies who may not even consider that, and then have a lot of people working in, living rooms and on couches, and really bleeding into their personal life, which over time can then take a toll. Availability training. So how do you show you're available? And the most important part of this is that everybody in the company has the same understanding. Maybe that's going on Slack and having your status as active on Slack. Maybe that's being active on another business social network. Maybe it's just answering emails within a certain amount of time. Maybe it's getting on doing a daily stand-up meeting at a certain time in the morning. So it's less important what the activity is and more important just that there's a common understanding, because that's going to help to really enhance trust. People know when others are available and they can rely on them. And the next area is really about technology. And I think Paul did a really nice job, summing up what the issues are with technology, and that again, it has to be democratized. Everybody has to be able to access all the different tools. And the New York City school system is a good example of this. After they canceled classes, they had 3 days where all the teachers and the teachers' aides, the paras, came in with no students. They learned Google Classroom. They learned some of the other tools. So then they could go away and they can actually be productive and be leaders to their students in that setting. If they wouldn't have done that, and there were IT issues anyway, but they were able to really get a lot of the teachers on board and create a productive environment by making sure that training was done on these technologies. Knowledge sharing. So how does everybody access knowledge? Is that Google Drive? Is that Dropbox? Is that people signing onto a VPN network that's a private VPN, right? Where is the knowledge stored? And this was one of the big points that Michael Pryor made from Trello, which was the place of the office, the knowledge of the office, right? Many of us are knowledge workers, right? So the knowledge of the office, wherever the knowledge is, that's where the office is. And that has to transfer from being a physical place to being a virtual place. So whatever tech you use to do that, that's important that everybody can access that knowledge. There's a company, Guru, that just raised $30 million last week, even in this type of environment. And basically that tool acts as a knowledge center for the company where people, as they're doing their normal tasks, the Guru will inject information into there and helpful tips so that somebody can then build upon the company knowledge. And I think this will be really the next area of remote working tools. After, last decade, it was about things like Trello, that's project management, Buffer, that's social media management, Slack, definitely widespread for communication. But I think that next phase will be tools like Guru that are really about knowledge management. Last in the technology part is mentorship. Some companies will be able to have people who have experience working remotely before, some won't. If you don't, it's definitely a good idea to get someone to just come in and speak to people who are working remotely for the first time and, sort of give them an idea of how to best set themselves up from a technology standpoint. In the last area of relationship readiness, trust was the -- factor that was mentioned by every person, whether working remotely or one of the leading companies in remote work. And yet it's not always done, right? Trust helps to improve morale. It helps to move things quicker. You can rely on others. You can produce better work. And you can do it in a few different ways. So Buffer uses values to do that. So they have 4 values that are default to transparency, communicate with clarity, choose positivity, and show gratitude. So that's the way that they unite people to trust each other because they all have the same values. It can also be done through activities where you have sort of smaller activities that are purposely done, proactively done, and then build to larger activities so people trust each other more over time. And final point is on measuring, and there's actually no standard measurement system for remote work, right? So I think here the important thing to take away is just to start collecting feedback that can be monitored over time. For me, I use Stand Uply and I connect it to Slack, and every other week it asks my team a job satisfaction question, which is like, how much do you understand the tasks that you're doing and how much do you enjoy them? And there are 5 answer choices. They can answer anywhere from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest, and there's some description there. And that helps me to get a sense check of, okay, are they understanding what's going on? Are they engaged? And that's thankfully actually gone up during this time of remote work. So that's really the modified model that we see ourselves in now that is really helpful that I personally use and all of us have used to enable good remote working environments.
Great, thank you so much, Anthony. So I don't know who wants to jump in here, but would love to hear some of the examples of things that you've done with your own teams. Anthony, you mentioned a few things to enhance their performance during this time.
Yeah. Sure. So a few things I've done, and I'll cover a few, and then Florian will jump in, and then Paul. One is defaulting to video. It's very easy to be, in a t-shirt and shorts, or your hair's not done, or whatever the case is, you don't really feel camera ready. Maybe you don't even want to look at yourself on the screen. But it's really important, especially in times when people are feeling so isolated, to just put a face out there. And especially if you're the team leader, I encourage you, just so much to put yourself out there. And and that's the third point here, to lead by example. And you be the one, turn on your video, encourage others to do that, get faces out there so that you can see each other. The daily digital check-ins, so every day, Monday through Friday, everybody on my team gets a message on Slack in their local time right at the beginning of their workday, which just asks them, what did you do yesterday? What are you doing today? And are there any blockers? If there are, I see them. I can go and speak with them about it right away. And it just helps for them to plan out their day also and make sure that we're all working on projects at the same time. Leading by example is just sharing your whole person. I probably share more with my team about what I do personally now than I ever did when I was working in the office with them. Whether that's I decide to clean up my backyard and do some gardening over the weekend or whatever it may be. I just make an active effort to really share more about myself in hopes that they will too, and they have. And it's really good for morale, especially in a remote setting. Florian, do you want to pick up the next one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So a little bit going further to this one, make use of automation. So working in a digital IT company that builds a platform, obviously have used quite some tools beforehand. But during this time, I really discovered how much possibilities of automation you actually have, like project management tools that actually have a recurring filter, so everything comes up on a regular basis. Because one thing that I discovered and that really was also shown to me by others was that you lose a little track of time when you work always in a remote setting. So you have some kind of routine. If you go to the office, you see people on a Tuesday for lunch, and then it's Tuesday, and Thursday is when you go to the gym, so that's why it's Thursday. But if this all vanishes, it really helps to get some standard automation processes that remind you of tasks that you do like once a month. To not forget them, make use of automation. It's definitely something you should consider doing. The other thing is, while most people probably have now started to block times in their calendars not to be disturbed and get some work done, I can encourage you to have the opposite as well, and make some time for everyone where you are available for a quick chat. So they don't have to block like always half hour, which is normally the default if you click on find a time slot, but just block 1 hour and people can jump in like for 5 minutes. So they don't have the need to really set up an official meeting with you, which they might not do at all, or they do just for half an hour. So having like 1 hour a day, or 45 minutes is it with me, that people are encouraged to just pop by and say, okay, I'll have a quick question here. Can you help me on this one? So to really open up the channels, you would normally meet people at the water cooler or in the kitchen or somewhere else, and this communication, it really gets a little bit easy going if you say, okay, you have 45 minutes. If you want to talk, just come by, and people just come by to say hello. But that's actually encouraging to feel connected and get the spirit of what other people are doing. So handing over to Paul.
Yeah, thanks so much, Florian. That they say that lost time is never found again, and I think we've probably all gone down many rabbit holes that we never maybe thought had existed. But I think for me, it's around there is talk that apparently many years back now that the French aristocracy in Paris and various other locations would actually walk down the street with a turtle on a leash to kind of slowly and eloquently look at the world around them and see what was going on and really connect maybe with so much of the activity that does take place around us. So I'm definitely not advocating for people getting a turtle during these times, but more so, nature is taking place around us in beautiful and wonderful ways. We see that, there is an ample opportunity to spend more time with your loved ones. And it's not to say that we shouldn't be doing great work at this period of time, because there is more time that we do have. We don't have to travel as much or as frequently and so on. But all that to say, there's probably almost never going to be a better time in history to connect with yourself, to connect with family, to connect with friends, to connect with nature and so on. So I highly recommend doing that, hopefully, as opposed to going down too many rabbit holes. The final piece is really just to say, look, it is actually a really difficult time, I think, that we're all going through. There will be news like, you know, layoffs, or there might be things like health issues for certain people in your team. You know, there might be other concerns that people have during this period. And, you know, obviously give that the full attention that it deserves, but also just think about what are some ways that you can leave things on a positive basis. You know, I think for all of us, a good gift goes a long way in the appropriate situation. And, you know, particularly with Tiger King maybe as a flourishing example of gifts to the infinite. You know, I really think it's great, if appropriate, to actually send out some really positive messages, because that's ultimately what people will go and maybe spend then a couple of hours thinking about that news in a slightly more detailed way than they might have historically. So just giving that slightly more positive ending to a conversation where appropriate can be a really positive thing as well.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you all so much for sharing. Do we want to move into Q&A now? Any final words before we do that?
We did a survey which we sent around. Maybe, Florian, do you want to just cover that quickly?
Yeah, I may do that quickly. So what we did is, and thanks for everyone of you who actually participated, and quickly running you through that survey. So 1 means you're not really paying too much attention on this one when you went to remote work. 6 means the highest attention was given to that one. So obviously you can see here availability and knowledge sharing were given much thought. 75% are in the 6 and 5 range, which means everyone was conscious about this one. Social interactions might be a little bit tricky one because it's in between. But let's focus on the other 2, which we really found interesting. The one is that tech training or focus on tools was only a third in the top range. So wasn't given too much thought on this one. What is interesting here is, and we haven't completely decided upon this one, whether people were already so good equipped beforehand that they could easily move from an in-office to a remote work setting. But definitely from our experience and what we found out in our research was it's always worth to really consider how tech really works in a remote setting for a longer time, because there are different skills that you need. Obviously you have to do most of the updates and so on and so forth yourself, but that's not only it. You have to get adapted to new tools without having interactions with people around you, which might be more tricky than opposed to just having a laptop that works. And finally, the thing where we see trust building. Trust building was at 45%, so it was given some thought, but we're pretty sure that this is something that if COVID-19 continues, much more thought has to be given, because building trust is the basis of the smooth working together. If you don't trust in the other people, you spend much more time on covering up and making sure that things are in the way you want to have them, as opposed to really pulling in the same direction and getting things done. So from the stats, and interesting to see that, yeah, we had so many people answering this. We have 47, I think, around that one, so close to 50. That was what we really, yeah, clearly saw that trust building is going to be the next top thing if COVID-19 continues.
Thank you so much for sharing those results. I think everyone's pretty shy in the chat, but we did receive a few questions from the when people registered. A couple of them I do think we've already covered, but this one comes from Michael. There are so many platforms and means of communicating with our business associates, from a Zoom call, telephone call, video call versus voice only, WeChat, WhatsApp. There is new etiquette being developed, but he'd like to hear your opinion, your take on which one to use under what circumstances.
Sure, I can jump in on that one. Yeah, one of the things that we did discover is it makes a lot of sense to match the channel to the message. So if it's something that needs a longer conversation or that some in-person interaction can be used, then definitely, like I said before, default to video. And then you want more of a video experience, as opposed to if it's something quicker, and a short check-in or just a quick question, then that's more apt for something like Slack or a messaging tool. And the most important part of this is that people are using the tech. So, I've frequently debated of WhatsApp versus Slack in a bunch of different groups that I'm a part of. And yes, Slack has some more features to it and definitely organizes things better. But if 100% of the people are going to use WhatsApp and 70% of the people are going to use Slack, then at this point, it makes more sense to use the platform that everybody's going to use, unless you can quickly train and get buy-in from the others. So it's a combination of what type of message are you looking to convey, and then what will actually get adoption within your team or organization.
Yeah, just to briefly add on that one as well, I think one of the really interesting questions to ask and consider is what types of information do you want to be capturing into whatever tool you might end up deciding on. So for example, one of the beautiful stories we heard in our research was some companies actually literally try to capture conversations in a virtual environment. So what we do there is, if I talk to you, if I say we're beginning a conversation.
Oh, I think I'm getting a little
Okay, Paul, I had to mute you. I know you're in Australia. I think something crazy is happening right there.
No, sorry about that. Is that a little bit better?
That's a lot better.
Sorry about that. So yeah, it was really saying that if we even have a casual conversation, so Emily and myself, we might have been talking about how our weekend was, that we might actually start a Google Doc and just actually capture the elements of that, even just casual conversation in a Google Doc, so that maybe other members of our team could actually see that conversation and be a part of that conversation if they wanted to. So it wasn't around everything being in a super structured way. It wasn't everything in terms of just a standard work procedure that we're talking about, but also then capturing those tacit conversations, which are a little bit more casual, but do provide the glue to an organization, are really, really important to think about as well.
Great. Thank you. So we do have one more question. I'm not sure if any of you will be able to speak to this. It's okay if not. Eileen was wondering how to overcome employee fear of people losing their job. I don't know if any of you have encountered that since the COVID-19 crisis hit.
Well, I can probably speak more from a continental European perspective. Currently, governments are pretty wide-ranging programs, setting up pretty wide-ranging programs. So they cover at least the basic stuff. And at least this has given lots of companies the opportunity to really keep people on board. Nevertheless, that's always something that's an issue in a recession time. While it doesn't help to really not speak about it, being open and transparent about what the perspective is of the company and where you currently stand is always helpful, so people are not caught by surprise if things move one or the other. That's at least my experience from the last crisis and the current one.
Thank you. Any final takeaways that you want to share with everyone before we wrap up?
Yeah, probably the final piece from our side is really just to say that, you know, we set out on this journey at the start of this conversation to say, look, you have certainly done some things wonderfully well, we're sure, given the crisis type situation that we're in. So, you know, do take that away to pat yourself on the back and say the fact that you're managing teams, managing organizations now in a very virtual environment that you hadn't done perhaps much of historically, that's a wonderful achievement in and of itself. Hopefully we've challenged you in terms of some of the ways of thinking about the stereotypes of virtual work. And then the third piece was really around hopefully empowering you after the crisis to potentially think about whether virtual work may be of assistance to you, your teams, your organization, your community. After that is something hopefully that we can give you or have given you a little bit of a flavor of here as well. This one main takeaway that we did have was really to suggest that it's actually not about that physical location being the real issue or the real challenge or the real opportunity. The real piece here is around that mental shift, both of the employee themselves and of the organization themselves. And really that there needs to be a meeting of minds there in order to really be able to do the virtual work experience in normal conditions really, really well. And then obviously then there might be slight adjustments that do need to take place in the COVID environment, but still that mental change and shift for everyone is just as important as what it ever has been.
Okay. You guys talked about, I'm sorry.
I just saw that there was another question coming up, and I wanted to make sure that we don't skip this one.
The observation from Todd.
Exactly. It's actually amazing how complex all the interactions are with face-to-face interaction. We have amazing tools nowadays, but it's still difficult to replicate being in the same room. That's exactly true. And to be very frank and open, all the companies, even the ones that are completely remote, have their time when they meet face-to-face. So Buffer, who's a completely virtual organization, they still meet. It's roughly each year and for a couple of weeks, and making sure that everyone really connects on a face-to-face setting as well.
Great. Well, you mentioned ending on a positive note. So does anyone want to share one thing that you're grateful for today?
That's very easy for me. I'm very grateful for everyone who joined us and gave us their time. I think it may be also the first time my mum and family have seen me present. So I hope I didn't do too bad a job, but I know they dialed in from Sydney. And so I'm very, very thankful for that. But also all the folks in Seattle for joining us, and our friends in Europe. We've got a couple there as well who have joined us. Andreas in Switzerland in particular, big shout out. So hugely appreciative to everyone who joined today.
That's great. Anthony or Florian?
Paul took mine, but I will say that I'm definitely grateful that that the three of us set out on this journey quite a few years ago, because while there have been so many changes that have happened with COVID, it's been good to have this foundation, this understanding that I can personally get satisfaction and productivity out of myself in a remote setting, and then really help my team to do that as well.
Florian, would you like to add one?
Yeah, well, I'm really grateful that we that we made this happen. It was a long start, and really some drawbacks as well. To get things published is not the easiest, as many of you might know. So really getting to that stage is something I'm really grateful, and having the friendship of Paul and Anthony is something that I very much appreciate.
Well, thank you so much. And I am grateful for everyone who joined us today, and the fact that we have the ability to put on this series. We focus so much on bringing leaders together. So finding a way to do that, even during a time of physical distancing, has meant a lot to us at World Trade Center Seattle. So we'll send out a survey later today. We'd really appreciate it if you take the time to fill it out. It's a short one. We appreciate your feedback. And our next program is next Thursday, May 7th. Hard to believe it's already May next week. And that one will focus on the impact that COVID-19 is having on mental health and how it's affecting business. So thank you all again for being here. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks all for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.